Detective Ginny O'Malley stared at the new case file on her desk, the words a cold shock to her system. The file was decades old, its pages yellowed and brittle, but the name on the cover was as fresh and terrifying as a childhood nightmare. Connor Pittman. The case file, a ghost from the past. The Little Rock Police Department was revisiting the conviction of a college student from a homicide that happened in the early 2000s. Connor Pittman, a once promising student at the University of Texas, had been convicted of the murder of a female friend during a drug-fueled binge. The case was a messy one, with a confession and a failed cover-up attempt involving his on-again, off-again girlfriend, who had fled to Mexico. The case was considered solved, but a new witness had come forward, a roommate of the victim, who had been too afraid to testify at the time. Her new statement had cast doubt on a few key details of the prosecution's case, forcing a re-examination. Ginny felt a familiar knot of dread in her stomach, a physical manifestation of a trauma she had spent years trying to suppress. She knew Connor Pittman. She had known him since kindergarten. He was the most popular boy in their class, a ringleader in a cruel campaign of psychological warfare against her. He was the primary perpetrator of the chronic bullying that had led to her complex PTSD. He was her personal childhood monster, and now, here he was, in her professional life. The privilege and the pain. Ginny remembered Connor as a boy with a charming smile and a cruel streak. He came from a well-respected family, and he had every opportunity for success. He had attended a private Catholic elementary school and then a high-end high school before going on to the University of Texas. But Ginny knew a different side of him. She knew the boy who had a talent for turning a joke into a torment, a friendly word into a veiled threat. She knew the boy who had used his charm and his family's reputation to get away with a lot more than just schoolyard pranks. She had heard about his spiral into substance abuse and his conviction years ago. It hadn't surprised her. She had seen the anger, the darkness, the self-destructive tendencies that had been simmering beneath the surface of his charming facade. He was a bully, but he was also a victim of a system that had enabled him, a system that had allowed him to believe that his actions had no consequences. Ginny felt a chilling wave of sadness and anger. The case was not just about a murder. It was about the tragic culmination of a life that had spiraled out of control, a life that had been shaped by a childhood where his cruelty was left unchecked. He had gone from a schoolyard bully to a murderer, a devastating but not surprising progression, a collision of past and present. Ginny and Ben, along with Finn and Echo, were now tasked with re-examining the case. This was not just a case about a murder, but a case about the consequences of trauma, both on the victim, the perpetrator, and all those who are affected by these criminal acts. It was a case that was about to force Ginny to face the very person who had caused her so much pain, to look into the eyes of the boy who had, in a cruel twist of fate, shaped her life's purpose. She was no longer a victim. She was a detective, and it was her job to find the truth, even if it meant confronting her own demons. The file was now open, and the contents were a descent into a nightmare that Ginny O'Malley had unknowingly been preparing for her entire career. The details of Connor Pittman's crime were a chilling echo of a true crime story, so heinous and specific that it felt like a ghost had whispered its secrets into the case file. The crime scene, baffling and brutal act. The victim's name was Janice Crowley, a beautiful, kind-hearted student who had been friends with Connor. The file described a horrifying scene in his off-campus apartment in Austin, Texas. The murder had occurred during a drug-fueled night of heavy partying. According to the original confession, Connor, in a blackout rage, had shot Janice. But the brutality of what came next, the meticulous and chilling steps to cover it up, spoke of a cold, calculated mind. Janice was also a student at the University of Texas and had met Connor at a frat party their sophomore year. They came from fairly similar backgrounds, raised by involved families, and had been successful in school. They never dated, but had been friends since their meeting and often spent time together. Janice had experienced her own troubles with substance abuse starting in her late teens, but not rising to the levels of Connor's involvement. The previous 6 months prior to her death had been some of her most mature and productive, leaving all facets of addiction that had plagued her previous several years. She had many positive things to look forward to. She was about to graduate college and had been accepted into law school, a dream years in the making that she had worked hard to bring to fruition. She had a summer internship at a law office before transitioning to law school that she was excited about. In fact, it was celebrating that achievement that she and Connor had been out doing the night of her death. Connor had called her, feeling down and in need of a friend. They decided to go out to dinner and then a local music club to celebrate her new successes. She had been in touch with a few friends in her family that night during their evening out, some of which had raised some concerns. Connor, high on drugs and agitated at life, had gotten increasingly unstable and irritable as the evening had proceeded. The night ended up being more of a chaotic affair, trying to keep Connor's emotions in check. Janice couldn't fully be the shoulder he needed to lean on that night, as she was starting her internship the following morning. The last interactions her family and friends had with her were on that night while out with Connor. The next day, Janice's mother had expected to hear from her daughter late in the afternoon, telling her about the first day of her internship. That call, unfortunately, would never come. Instead, she received a call from one of the firm's attorneys. Janice's boss was reaching out to her emergency contacts at the end of the day as Janice had not shown up for her internship. This was unexpected with the enthusiasm she had portrayed during their interview. Dorothy Hay, the owner of the law firm, had tried to reach her several times that day to no avail. Nor had anyone else been able to reach her. Dorothy placed a call to her mother stating that she had expected Janice to be there for the start of her internship that day, and she had not shown up nor answered phone calls trying to get in touch. Nina, Janice's mother, immediately got an uneasy feeling. It would not have been like Janice to have not shown up, as she was an overall very responsible young lady and had so been looking forward to this opportunity. She thanked Dorothy for letting her know and said she would try and get in contact with her daughter. Nina spoke with her husband, Janice's stepfather, and they tried to get in contact with her. But every call and text went unanswered. After an hour, they decided to drive the 3 hours to try and get in touch with Janice in person. On the drive there, they reached out to a few friends to see if they had heard from her that day. None of them had. They also reached out to Connor since he had been with her the previous night. The reaction they got only worsened their anxiety about their daughter. They got him on the phone, and he was irritable and dismissive and gave no useful information other than confirming they had gone out together the previous night, but he didn't know anything beyond that. He quickly hung up, and when they called back, he had the callousness to state to them that he was busy eating pizza and to leave him alone. This gave them a sickening feeling that this could turn out badly, seeing as the last person Janice was known to be with was apathetic and annoyed at being questioned about her whereabouts. Janice's parents drove in an uneasy silence, hoping for a positive turnout upon their arrival, but fearing that it may be something very different and unwelcome. They arrived at where they knew their daughter had last been seen, the apartment complex of Connor Pittman. When they arrived, their daughter's car was in the parking lot of the apartment complex. They knocked on the door of Connor's apartment to no answer. They called the police to report their daughter missing. The police responded and took down their information. They knocked on the door of the apartment and looked in both Janice's and Connor's cars in the parking lot. Without any further probable cause, the police could not break into the apartment. They were left with the number of a missing persons detective that would follow up and a case number. Feeling distraught and somewhat hopeless, they continued to look around the complex. Nina's husband, John, Janice's stepfather, was finally able to open a window that was in the bathroom of the apartment. He climbed in, only to be shocked by what had been left in that bathtub. No disturbance had been immediately apparent before just looking in through the window from the outside. He had discovered where Janice was, in a heartbreaking way that would forever shape their lives to a before and after. They found her in the apartment, her body partially dismembered in a bathtub, and attempts had been made to dissolve the remains with chemicals. The scene was one of almost unimaginable horror, a stark contrast to the lively, vibrant world of a college student's apartment. The family called the police again, and the investigation began. The search was on for Connor, as he was nowhere to be seen and appeared to clearly have fled after realizing that bodies were not so easy to be gotten rid of. Connor and his girlfriend Lindsey Hill were on their way to Mexico. They would enjoy 5 days of additional freedom in a border town before being apprehended by Mexican authorities and brought back to the U.S. to face charges. Their continued immaturity had likely been their undoing, the couple being recognized by a hotel employee who had called in a tip. While waiting for the search for Connor and Lindsey, the police had been collecting evidence, talking to witnesses, and gathering whatever information they could about this unnecessary crime. The gruesomeness of the attempted cover-up had given them several leads to look into. Janice's body had been partially dismembered, her head and hands having been removed. There was a hacksaw that was left laying on her torso. The police obtained security footage of Connor at a local home supply store purchasing the items that were in the bathroom. They even questioned an employee who had interacted with Connor about his items. Connor stated he was going to cut up a frozen turkey with the hacksaw he was purchasing, and the other apparent cleaning supplies were to clean his apartment. With Connor's and Lindsey's return, they were questioned at length about the circumstances surrounding the death of Janice. Connor could not give much information, as he said he had no memory of that night. He admitted to having been drunk and high on cocaine, to such an extent that he was in a blackout drugged fog, of which he had no clear details of anything that had occurred. He did remember contacting Janice earlier that day, and he recalled waking up to the realization that Janice was dead in his apartment, appearing to have been shot by his gun. Still somewhat dazed, he even contacted another friend who lived in the apartment complex, Nikki Solomon, and went to her apartment around 3:30 a.m., telling an unrealistic story about being in a shootout in his apartment. Nikki hadn't heard any gunshots and thought it was more of a paranoid story made up in a drugged haze, as Connor had clearly been drinking. He leaves, and Nikki didn't dwell on the interaction until she heard the news of what had happened. She did initially give a statement to detectives, although she didn't have much about the incident to say, but it did help with a timeline of events. Connor and Lindsey were both questioned, but investigators were left with an unclear picture of what had happened that night. Lindsey had downplayed her role in the killing of Janice and her involvement in the cover-up and absconding. This would, over time, be found to be far from true. Lindsey Hill was as cold and self-serving as Connor was, and she was deep in obsession with Connor and would do anything still to help him. In a disturbing revelation, she had even gotten Connor's name tattooed after the death of Janice. As undying as her love and obsession appeared to be for Connor, it had certainly never been seen to be reciprocated according to any of their mutual acquaintances. Connor cared for her as a somewhat girlfriend and sex partner, but he was not in love with her. Ginny felt a wave of revulsion and a deep, cold certainty. This wasn't the work of a man in a blackout rage. This was the work of a monster. The methodical dismemberment, the use of chemicals, the chilling calm of the act, it all spoke of a mind that was not just deranged by drugs, but was fundamentally broken. This was the same cruelty she had seen in the schoolyard bully, only now it had found a new horrifying outlet, a partner in crime. The original investigation had been complicated by the involvement of Connor's girlfriend, Lindsey Hill. She was a key figure in the attempted cover-up. She had helped him dispose of the remains and had even tried to take money out of Janice's bank account. She and Connor had fled to Mexico, where they had been apprehended a few days later, drunk and high. Lindsey's involvement was a chilling detail, a testament to the power of a shared dark secret. She had not been a victim, but a willing participant. She was a silent partner, a co-conspirator who had been swept up in Connor's life of chaos, a collision of past and present. Ginny and Ben, now with a new witness who had come forward, had a chance to re-examine the case. The witness, a friend of Janice's, who had been too afraid to testify, had cast doubt on some of the key details of the prosecution's case. She claimed to have seen Connor and Lindsey in the apartment, and she also claimed to have seen something else, something that had been dismissed as a detail and not a clue. Ginny felt a profound sense of sadness. The boy she had known as a bully, the man who had been a specter from her past, was a murderer. But he was also a man who had been a victim of his own choices, a tragic product of a life that had spiraled out of control. The case was not just about a murder, but about the insidious nature of bullying, the devastating consequences of addiction, and the terrible power of a silent, shared secret. Ginny looked at the files, her heart aching. The case of Janice Crowley was not just a cold case. It was a story about a little girl who had been bullied by a boy who grew up to be a killer. She had survived him once, and now it was her job to find the truth, to give a voice to a victim who had been silenced, and to close a chapter of her own life that had been left open for far too long. Ginny O'Malley closed the file on Connor Pittman, the silence in the office broken only by the low hum of the air conditioner. She knew this case was unlike any other. It wasn't just about a murder. It was about the insidious nature of unaddressed trauma and the tragic consequences of a life left unchecked. The plan. "We can't approach this like a normal cold case," Ginny said to Ben, her voice low and filled with a rare vulnerability. "We're not just looking for a confession. We're looking for the truth." Ben, sensing her emotional turmoil, nodded in agreement. Ginny went on to explain her theory that Connor, while a murderer, was also a victim of his unchecked behavior, his substance abuse, and a lack of intervention from his family. His family's wealth and status allowed them to ignore his destructive patterns, to sweep his bullying under the rug. In some odd way, his unchecked bullying was a cry for help that no one heard. The very things that should have saved him, she said, were the things that led to his demise. They shifted their focus to the new leads. Connor's inability to recall the events of that night, a result of a drug and alcohol-fueled blackout, left a gaping hole in the narrative. And Lindsey, his sometime girlfriend, had given conflicting versions of her involvement, her stories shifting like sand, but the most damning evidence came from two inmates who had been incarcerated with Lindsey after her apprehension. They had testified that she had confessed to them that she, not Connor, was the actual killer. The motive? a fit of jealousy over Connor's interest in Janice. This new theory that Lindsey was the actual murderer explained the chilling details of the dismemberment and the meticulous cleanup. A crime of passion, not a drug-fueled rage. A glimmer of hope. The next day, Ginny and Ben went to meet with Janice Crowley's parents. They were a dignified, grieving couple who had never given up hope for a full account of their daughter's final moments. They had always believed there was more to the story than what the police had told them. Ginny, with a level of empathy that came from a place of deep personal understanding, told them about the new evidence. She explained that their goal was not to relitigate a conviction, but to give them the one thing they had been denied, closure. "We're not going to leave any stone unturned," Ginny said, her voice filled with a quiet determination. "We're going to find out what happened to your daughter." Janice's parents, after years of pain, saw a glimmer of hope. They had been left with an unresolved silence for years, a void that had been filled with a mountain of unanswered questions. Ginny and Ben were not going to leave them with that silence. They were going to give them the truth. A new chapter. The next step was to find Lindsey Hill. She had moved far away from the familiarity of Austin, TX after serving her sentence, and with no recent contact with her family, she was a ghost. Ginny, however, had a new strategy. She and Ben would use their knowledge of the criminal underworld to find her. They would work with federal authorities, and they would follow the money, the drugs, and the people that Lindsey had been in contact with. They were not just looking for a witness, they were looking for a killer. The case was no longer just about a bully who had become a murderer. It was about a detective who was determined to bring a murderer to justice and to find the truth for a family who had been left with nothing but an unending silence. The inmate's confession. Their first stop was a maximum security prison. Ginny and Ben, accompanied by a small group of prison guards, walked into a small, sterile room. They were there to speak to the two inmates who had come forward about Lindsey's confession. The two women were hardened criminals, their faces etched with the scars of a life of crime. They were tough, cynical, and at first they were reluctant to talk. They had no interest in helping the police. But Ginny, with her unique ability to connect with people on a human level, managed to get them to open up. They told a chilling story, a story that was a far cry from the one that had been told in court. Lindsey, they said, had confessed to them in the dead of night. Her voice a whisper in the dark, her face a mask of profound guilt. She had told them that she had been the one who had killed Janice in a fit of drug-fueled jealousy. She had been high, and she had seen a connection between Janice and Connor that she had always feared. The murder, she confessed, had been a crime of passion, an act of rage that had been fueled by a toxic mix of jealousy and drugs. The dismemberment, the cleanup, the meticulous steps to hide the body, it was all Lindsey's doing. The inmate stories, though not a confession in the eyes of the law, were a chilling confirmation of Ginny's gut feeling. They had no reason to lie, no motive to make up a story that would incriminate a woman who had been a ghost for years. The details of the murder were so specific, so brutal, that they could only have come from someone who had been there. The stories corroborated each other, a double check on a truth that had been buried for years. The search for Lindsey. With the inmates' testimonies, Ginny and Ben now had a powerful new tool in their arsenal. They were no longer looking for an accomplice. They were looking for a killer. They contacted their contacts in the FBI, a network of law enforcement and criminal informants who had been working with them on a variety of cases. They gave them a profile of Lindsey, a detailed description of her criminal history and her connections. The information was a goldmine, and a new lead soon emerged. Lindsey, it turned out, was living in a small town in Arizona, a place that had been a part of her life for years. She had been living under an alias, but her past had caught up with her. She'd been working as a small-time drug dealer, a life she had been living since her time in Austin. The information was a beacon of hope, a light in the dark that had been a part of the case for so long. The case was no longer just about a bully who had become a murderer. It was about a detective who was determined to bring a murderer to justice and to give a family who had been left with nothing but an unanswered silence a final, powerful truth. Ginny O'Malley sat in a sterile, gray-walled meeting room at the prison, the familiar scent of disinfectant and regret hanging in the air. The man who walked in was a ghost of her childhood tormentor, a hollowed-out version of the charming, cruel boy she had known. Connor Pittman's face was gaunt, his eyes cloudy with the years of substance abuse and prison. He was no longer the untouchable bully she remembered. He was a broken man. The truth revealed. Ginny got straight to the point, her voice calm and even. "I'm not here to rehash your conviction, Connor. I'm here to find the truth about what happened to Janice Crowley." She explained the new evidence, the inmates' testimonies, and the new forensic analysis of the old evidence. Connor listened in silence, his face unreadable. He'd always claimed to have blacked out that night and could not recall the events. Ginny told him about his relationship with Janice, their platonic friendship, and their mutual love of music. There had been no romantic relationship and no motive for him to have harmed her. "You were her friend, weren't you?" Ginny asked. Connor nodded, a single tear rolling down his cheek. Ginny then introduced the new evidence, Lindsey's confession to her cellmates. She then told him about the forensic evidence found on the gun. Lindsey's DNA was on the trigger of the gun found in his car after the crime. Her involvement in tampering with the body and fleeing the country was an attempt to cover up a crime she had committed, not one that he had. The unspoken truth. Ginny leaned forward, her voice low and filled with a quiet certainty. "You may not have been the murderer, Connor, but you were the motive and the cause of her death." Connor looked at her, his face a mask of profound grief. "Your substance abuse, your relationship with Lindsey, your refusal to get help, it all created a perfect storm. Janice was a casualty of your life, not your enemy." The silence in the room was deafening. Connor stared at her, and Ginny could see a flicker of the old bully's arrogance, but it was quickly replaced by a heartbreaking admission of guilt. He knew she was right. He had never intended to harm Janice, but his life had spiraled so far out of control that it had led to her death. Ginny gave him a final piercing look, and in that moment she wasn't just a detective. She was a survivor, a victim of his past who had come full circle. He had been a boy who had refused to get help, and he had, in a cruel twist of fate, ended up a murderer. The case was not just about a crime, it was about the insidious nature of unresolved trauma and the long-term effects it could have on both the victims and the perpetrators. The case was closed for her, but for Connor, it was a life sentence, a bitter victory. The investigation into Lindsey Hill was now an active, ongoing case. Ginny and Ben, now with a new lead and a renewed sense of purpose, were determined to find her and bring her to justice. For Ginny, the case was more than just a job. It was a way to give Janice Crowley a voice and a way to finally close a chapter of her own life that had been left open for far too long. Ginny O'Malley closed the cold case file on Connor Pittman for the last time. It was a chapter of her life she had hoped to close for years. Now, with a new suspect in her sights, she was ready to bring justice to a family who had been left with a lifetime of pain. Ginny and Ben, along with Finn and Echo, were now tasked with finding a ghost from the past, a woman who had, for a brief moment, been a part of her own life. This was a chapter of her life that was about to be closed for good. A new trail, the search for Lindsey Hill, took Ginny and Ben to a small, dusty town in Arizona. They were armed with a new lead and a new sense of purpose. They were no longer looking for an accomplice, but a killer. They followed the trail of her criminal history, her substance abuse, and her connections to a small town that had been a part of her life for years. The town was a world away from the manicured lawns and college campuses of Little Rock, a place where secrets were kept, and silence was a way of life. They were in a different world, but their mission remained the same: to find the truth no matter the cost. The confrontation. They found Lindsey living a quiet, low-profile life, a ghost in her own town. She was older now, her face etched with the scars of a life lived on the run. The carefree, reckless girl from the college photos was gone, replaced by a hard-eyed woman who was ready to fight. She denied everything, her voice a low whisper that was filled with anger and resentment. "You have nothing on me," she said, her eyes flashing with a cold fury. "You have nothing to prove that I did anything." Ginny, with a level of empathy that came from a place of deep personal understanding, looked at her. "We're not here to prove anything, Lindsey," she said. "We're here to give you a chance to tell your side of the story." Ginny told her about the inmates who had come forward, about the DNA on the gun, and about the tragic circumstances that had led to Janice's death. She told her that they knew she had been a victim as well, a victim of her own obsession and her unrequited love for Connor. Lindsey's defenses crumbled, her tough facade melting into a mask of profound grief and regret. She confessed, her voice a low whisper filled with a lifetime of pain. She had been the one who had killed Janice. She had been filled with a rage that had been fueled by a toxic mix of jealousy and drugs. The dismemberment, the cleanup, the lies. It was all her doing. She had been the one who had tried to take a young girl's life, and she had been the one who had gotten away with it for too many years. Lindsey originally had been charged with only evidence tampering and hindering apprehension. She had served approximately 6 years of a 10-year sentence, but considering the truth of her true involvement, this was certainly not justice served. Lindsey Hill was charged with Janice's death and pleaded guilty to a reduced charge of manslaughter. She was sentenced to serve 35 years with the possibility of parole after having served at least 80% of her sentence. The truth at last. Lindsey's confession was a chilling and heartbreaking story of a woman who had, in a moment of madness, committed a terrible crime. She was a murderer, but she was also a victim, a woman who had been left to face the consequences of her actions alone. She was a testament to the power of a jealous rage, the corrosive nature of a secret, and the tragic consequences of a life left unchecked. The case was now closed, but for Ginny, it was more than just a closed case. It was a testament to the power of a woman's intuition, a lifelong search for justice, and a final, powerful act of love. She had found the truth, she had given a family closure, and she had, in her own way, finally found peace. Childhood trauma, particularly from chronic bullying, can profoundly shape a person's life, influencing their career, relationships, and sense of self. It can instill hypervigilance and a deep sense of intuition, turning a defense mechanism into a powerful tool. That hypervigilance had once likely been of Billy James Lawson, a predator of children that had tried to lure her past his blue truck. Ginny's story is a testament to this, showing how her painful past gave her a unique ability to see the unseen, to understand the lost and the broken, and to fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves. The aftermath and the lessons learned. The case of Connor Pittman and Janice Crowley was a brutal but vital chapter in Ginny's life. It forced her to confront her own demons, to look into the face of a man who had caused her so much pain, and to see not just a monster but a person who was also a victim of a system that had failed him. It was a case that, in a way, gave her closure, a chance to finally put a name and a face to her trauma and to show that she was no longer a victim. The case was also a reminder of the devastating consequences of unaddressed trauma. Connor's unchecked bullying, his entitlement, and his lack of consequences had, in a cruel twist of fate, turned him into a murderer. It was a stark lesson that bullying is not just a childhood rite of passage. It's a dangerous, insidious form of psychological warfare that can have a lasting impact on both the bully and the victim. The power of speaking up. Ginny's story is a powerful reminder of the importance of speaking up. The teachers and students who had, for years, remained silent as Ginny was tormented had been a part of a system that had failed her. Their silence was a form of complicity, an unspoken permission for Connor to continue his cruel behavior. Ginny's story is a plea to those who are on the sidelines, to those who see something that they know isn't or doesn't feel right to speak up. It's a reminder that one person's voice can change a person's life, and that the silence of the many can be as harmful as the actions of a few. The case of Janice Crowley was a tragic testament to the power of a life left unchecked. Hope. A story of a detective who had, in her own way, finally found peace. She had found a way to turn her pain into a purpose, to find the lost souls and give them a voice. She had found a way to show that even in the darkest of places, there is always a glimmer of hope.